Hi, I'm Elijah Furr, and this is Crash Course World History. Join us today as we talk about battlefields, baguettes, and bayonets. Of course, I mean the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. The mid-1700s, what a time. Colonists were becoming less and less British, child labor was everyone's favorite thing, and the Europeans were fighting over a little piece of land called the Ohio River Valley, sparking the First World War.
Mr. Furr, I thought World War I was the First World War.
Oh, you cannot be more wrong. Over in Europe, you had Great Britain and Prussia fighting against the French, Russians, and Austrians, but that's a topic for another time. Today, we'll just focus on the more North American side of things. So if you're ready to talk about valleys, forts, rebellions, and questionable decisions made by high-ranking military generals, throw on your tricorns and get ready to talk about the 7 Years' War that, strangely enough, lasted for 9 years. The 7 Years' War, fought mainly between the French, their native allies, and the British, lasted for 9 years, but the fighting really only lasted for like 7 years. That's where it gets its name from. But why were they fighting? Well, the British wanted to expand westward to further their trading opportunities, and the Ohio River Valley was perfect for that. The only problem was they couldn't decide whether it was the British Empire or the French's. That wasn't the biggest problem, though. A much, much larger problem loomed over them. Which country would dominate North America? By the middle of the 18th century, British people had begun moving west of the Appalachians. Hundreds of Pennsylvanian traders and Amerindian people lived in the upper Ohio Valley. And then the French showed up. The French, who possessed control of Canada, started pushing their way into the Ohio River Valley. Now that they had a small presence in the upper Ohio River, one day in 1749, they decided they'd have a word with the Pennsylvanians. The Pennsylvanians were asked to lower their British flags and retreat east of the Appalachians, but British people being British people, they didn't listen. In 1752, the French decided to use force. They attacked the British Trading Center in Pickawillany and proceeded to kill every single English-speaking trader they could find. The Virginian government believed that the Upper Ohio were given to them in the 1609 charter given by King James I. When news reached Williamsburg that the French were driving out English traders, people were not happy. So in 1753, good old George Washington was sent to warn the French garrison that they were on Virginian land. And guess what? They didn't listen. God, imagine what history would be like if people actually listened to each other. But obviously they didn't. So the Ohio Company was told to build a fort by the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers, and they did. The French, however, took over the uncompleted fort in 1754 before Colonel Joshua Fry could arrive. And then Fry died. Washington took command over the militia and decided to make a new post, Fort Necessity. Fort Duquesne, owned by the French, was about 40 miles away from this new fort. That meant French people were already nearby. On May 28th, Washington and his forces attacked the French scouting party, killing Commander Colin de Jumonville and 9 others, as well as taking 20 prisoners. Little did Washington know he had just started a war. After hearing of Washington's ambush, the French were not pleased. They were all like, no, we will not have this. And then they attacked Fort Necessity. Washington had reinforcements from Virginia and North Carolina, but the French and Indians outnumbered them nearly 2-1. After a few hours of fighting, the French offered to let the British leave so long as they left the Ohio Territory for a year. But by this point, Washington has lost 30 men and 70 injured, so he reluctantly surrendered. Of course, that wasn't the end for the British, but that's the end for me now. I'm going to hand this off to my good friend Ari.
Hey everyone, I'm Ari. I'll be picking up where Elijah left off. So, where were we? Right, Fort Necessity. So, after Washington's defeat, Virginia asked London for assistance, but King George II was like, nah, they got this. But it very quickly became obvious that the colonists could not defend themselves. Edward Braddock was sent to Fort Duquesne to kick the French out, and Edward Boscawen was sent to St. Lawrence to prevent further French reinforcement. On July 9, 1755, Braddock and a handful of soldiers went on ahead of the rest of his transport to see what was really going on at Fort Duquesne. However, they were ambushed by the French and their native allies and effectively started the Battle of Monongahela. The battle lasted for several hours and witnessed the destruction of a ton of Braddock's men. Eventually, Braddock realized he needed to retreat, but got shot before he could issue the order. So it was up to Washington to follow up with his commands and bring the army back to safety. I'll let Braddock himself tell you the rest.
So, General Braddock, you're infamously known for a battle deemed Braddock's defeat. Can you give us a rundown of what happened during this battle?
Very well. As the acting commander of British forces in the New World, I decided to take my men to Fort Duquesne, teach those Frenchmen a lesson. However, as it would be, those Frenchmen and natives decided to hide behind trees and bushes to ambush us. They know nothing of glory.
Interesting. I'm curious. Here it says you were carried away from the
I
battle.
believe that's enough for now. Let's take a brief intermission. See, time makes everything better. What was your question? Oh yes, I remember. When I was heroically carried off the field that day, it was only after fighting to my very last.
Did you say heroic? That little whining and crying like a little time. What a little.
My fellow soldier, George Washington, had to drag me from the field of battle and would not let me return. The last thing I saw before my passing was the face of my honorary colonel, Washington. Looking up at that young man's face made me hopeful for the future of the British Empire, and I knew it would thrive in the New World for centuries to come, with nothing to stand in its way.
Interesting. Moving on from that, historians have attributed your defeat of Monongahela to the French and Amerindians having superior warfare tactics. Is it true that you attempted to use an outdated form of line warfare in a heavily wooded area?
Who are you to question my tactics? I simply took a group of my most efficient soldiers up ahead to scout the French defenses. I see nothing wrong with that. I'm not to blame.
Sure. This defeat accelerated the French-Indian War from just a few battles into a genuine war in North America. But it was also the battle that George Washington himself learned how to utilize guerrilla warfare. How do you feel about your defeat playing a major part in starting the 7 Years' War, as well as costing England their colonies during the American Revolution? It seems like you are to blame.
Cease with your endless
Cut!
This interview is
Cut.
concluded.
That got violent. Anyways, after Braddock's defeat, the British were going to lose more battles at more forts, like Fort Oswego, William Henry, and commanders like Lord Loudon and James Abercrombie would lose attacks that they made on the French. The British were not kept down long, however. William Pitt began to funnel tons of resources into North America to get rid of the French once and for all. Most importantly, the British Royal Navy, which cut off New France's supply lines. The tides of war had turned into British favor. Fort Frontenac, Duquesne, Niagara, Carillon, and Crown Point had all been defeated. The climax of the war came with the Battle of Quebec. French commanders Wolfe and Montcalm were both fatally wounded, forcing the French to surrender all of Canada and pretty much eliminating their presence in North America. The 1763 Treaty of Paris ultimately ended the war, forcing the French to surrender Canada and all claims to land east of the Mississippi River. So France and Britain made peace, but there was still one more group left. In 1763, in an event known as Pontiac's Rebellion, Amerindian tribes struck and captured British settlements in a very massive uprising. They argued that the French never really owned the land to begin with and couldn't just give it away to the British. The British tried to make peace with the natives by issuing the Proclamation Line of 1763, which pretty much prevented westward expansion. This would greatly anger the colonists, though, and would eventually lead to a series of events that sparked the American Revolution. That's a story for another time, though, and that's all for today. But first, let's summarize.
The Indian War, or 7 Years' War, lasted from 1754 to 1763 and was caused by a series of conflicts in the Ohio River Valley between the French and British. Many back-and-forth battles between England and France, such as the Battle at Fort Necessity, where French and Amerindian forces attacked a British fort defended by George Washington. The defeat, when General Edward Braddock attacked Fort Duquesne, marked a major loss for the British, and the Battle of Quebec, which occurred after William Pitt turned the war in British favor, marked a major defeat for the French. Eventually ended with the 1763 Treaty of Paris, forcing France to surrender all North American territory. The natives argued that the land couldn't be given away and rebelled in an event known as Pontiac's Rebellion. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was then issued to make peace with the natives, although it angered the colonists and sparked dissent. Thanks, Thought Bubble.
And don't worry, if you're still confused about everything, these people are too.
French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War?
You know, I'm gonna have to say the French and Indian War because, you know, they were fighting on American ground and Canadian ground. That was a new thing. And the French, they learned their lesson because we're not about that.
Yeah.
We're, you know, Americans, we instigated that. We helped them fight each other.
Yeah.
We're on the Indian side, we're on the American side.
Sure.
I don't like French people, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, did you know that the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War were the same war?
I actually did, but I forgot about that.
Well, that's a teachable moment, guys.